I'm joined today by Sarah Levin, who's the Senior Legislative Associate for the Secular Coalition for America. She represents the organization on Capitol Hill and in states across the country lobbying to protect secular government. Sarah, we've got a situation in the United States where many people have sort of the implicit understanding that one of the parts of the deal for churches being and religious organizations being tax exempt, they can't do politics. And whether this means lobbying for or against particular candidates or issues is an issue of some debate. But I think many of us have that general understanding. And a lot of this relates to something called the Johnson Amendment. So maybe that's a good place to start. What's the infrastructure that says, hey, you can't do politics if you're a tax-exempt religious organization?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start by defining a few terms because there's a few things you have to kind of understand before you understand what the Johnson Amendment is. I'm going to start by talking about a 501c3 nonprofit. So from now and the rest of the segment, I'll be saying nonprofit, but I'm really referring to a specific set, 501c3s. So think about your local soup kitchen, American Red Cross. These are a type of nonprofit that are subject to the Johnson Amendment, and they're not only tax exempt, but there's another very special privilege that they have, and that is that when people donate to them, their donations are tax deductible. So again, think about, when you donate to your local soup kitchen, to the homeless shelter, you can deduct that on your taxes. That's a pretty significant incentive for people to donate, especially for those who are donating in the thousands or tens of thousands, right? So those two privileges come with strings attached. And the Johnson Amendment, which was passed in 1954, was actually introduced by Senator Johnson before he was President Johnson, passed by Republican Congress, signed by a Republican president. And it basically prohibits 501c3 nonprofits from endorsing or opposing political candidates and otherwise intervening, for example, giving money to partisan campaigns. And it's important to understand there are actually a lot of things C3s can do when it comes to elections. So for example, you can talk about issues. You could do a voter education campaign. You can say, here's where candidate Clinton stands on X, Y, and Z issue, and here's where Trump stands on X, Y, and Z issue. As long as your nonprofit doesn't say, vote for X candidate, you haven't broken the law, as long as you're not, endorsing.
Now, one
You can.
question there, just to jump in as a point of clarity, Sarah. Where would it fall within these restrictions to say something like, here is the position of candidate A on abortion, here is the
Mhm.
position of candidate B on abortion? The godly thing to do is to, generally speaking, support candidates with the following position on that issue. Is that clearly on one side of the line or the other?
It definitely does blur the line, but it would probably pass, to be honest, as
Hmm.
long as it didn't say, if they didn't say, so you should vote for this candidate,
Quite
because
lenient in a sense, then.
it is actually very lenient. And so that's status quo. But another thing you have to understand why the religious right is so interested in this topic, because of course the Johnson Amendment applies to all nonprofits, but houses of worship, I'll just say churches, are a type of 501c3 nonprofit, and they have a very special privilege that all other nonprofits don't have, and that is that they don't have to file the same financial disclosures to the IRS that all other nonprofits do. So, for example, especially these big organizations, a lot of them just put what they call the Form 990 that they have to submit to the IRS. They put it online so you can download it. So it's something that is available upon request for everyday citizens. So if you want to decide if it's a good idea to give to this nonprofit versus that nonprofit, you can go and look at their Form 990s and see if they run their organization with integrity. You can see their revenues, expenses, how much the CEO is paid, that kind of stuff. Churches are the only nonprofits that don't have to file the full and complete Form 990. That's again status quo as it is. So keeping all of that in mind, what will happen if the Johnson Amendment is repealed or weakened or not enforced? And there's a lot of different attacks coming from different sides, and I'll talk about that in a second. There's
Yeah.
bills. Is that it'll impact all nonprofits and the integrity of the nonprofit sector in general, but it will specifically open up for houses of worship, for churches, a new dark hole for campaign money to flow through. Because if all of a sudden clergy can endorse or oppose candidates more, directly from the pulpit, and that's legal, then you can imagine if they don't have to file any financial disclosure as it is, they could easily take donations and donate to campaigns, and there would be absolutely no trace. There would be no paper trail.
Yeah. So let's take this through in a few component parts. So there's this 2018 Financial Services General Government Appropriations Bill, and it has a provision, Section 116, which directs the IRS no longer to enforce the Johnson Amendment specifically for houses of worship. So that to give the audience one example, you talked about the weakening of the Johnson Amendment. That's one example of how this could happen. Let's say
Right.
that takes place, that goes through and Section 116 is made part of that bill. What can churches now immediately do that they previously could not do?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that they're already violating the law openly and getting away with it.
Of
So we would
course.
just see more of that. It would basically be open season.
Yeah.
The Alliance Defending Freedom, which is kind of like the legal arm of the Christian right, has been really leading the effort on repealing or weakening the Johnson Amendment. And ever since 2008, they've been doing an annual Pulpit Freedom Sunday, where they encourage clergy to endorse from the pulpit, tape themselves doing it, and send the tapes to the IRS. So let's be clear, this is not being enforced as is. So basically, what will happen is that will get much worse. These groups are going to be much more brazen. And actually, we've been lobbying with faith communities about this issue because they're opposed to changing the Johnson Amendment. 89% of evangelical pastors, when asked if they think that clergy should be endorsing for the pulpit, said no. The majority of Americans of faith across denominations oppose this. Why? Because they don't want their churches to be targeted. It's very easy for them if the local council person or state legislator or federal legislator running for office comes to the church and say, hey, it'd be really great if you endorse me, for them to say, well, sir or ma'am, that's illegal. I'm not allowed to do that. Once they can't say that anymore, it's going to be very difficult to avoid that kind of pressure, both from candidates and their own members. And it can really divide congregations that are really meant to be sacred, a place for worship. So people of faith and clergy don't want their churches to be politicized. So we're going to see more of that. We're going to see more of that brazen behavior. And what we're most worried about is, because there will be pretty much no accountability whatsoever, is that financial dark hole for campaign money to start flowing through completely untraceable.
Yeah, and I actually don't have a problem with houses of worship doing politics. As someone who's non-religious myself, I don't really care too much what houses of worship are saying, presuming that it's not inciting violence or telling people to go attack others or commit crimes or whatever the case may be. I don't actually have a problem if churches wanted to say, hey, we are going to take political positions, but they should not be tax exempt, period, if that's the case.
Exactly.
And there's no way that
Exactly.
that's going to be rolled back anytime soon.
Right. I mean, the thing is that the 501c3 status, it's a privilege. It's not a right. And they can, it's a choice too. If you want to say, we're going to be a church, but we're going to kind of, forego the C3 status and pay the taxes, do whatever you want. That the problem is that this is on the taxpayer's dime. And the opposition is trying to frame this as a free speech issue. But it's really not, because when the taxpayers are footing the bill, there's strings attached. You can say whatever you want on your own dime, but not on the taxpayer's dime.
Real quick, Sarah, what other ways, other than that Section 116 of the Appropriations Bill, is the Johnson Amendment being attacked?
That's a great question. So there's a few bills that are kind of the Section 116, as you mentioned, is a rider on an appropriations bill. There's also the Free Speech Fairness Act, which has two companion bills in the House and the Senate. And basically, it would it's not a straight repeal. There's another bill in the House that would be a straight repeal, just completely striking the language altogether. The Free Speech Fairness Act weakens it by allowing nonprofits to get involved in endorsing political and opposing candidates, and also spending a de minimis amount of money on campaigns. And that just opens a whole, can of worms of what is de minimis, because de minimis means insubstantial. Well, if you're the university president of Notre Dame, and you send an email to the entire alumni network saying you should vote for this person, well, that didn't really cost you anything to press the send button on an email, but you certainly just helped that candidate a whole lot.
Yeah.
And so
Not to
that
mention that for these gigantic megachurches, there could be an amount that's insubstantial for them based on their size and budget, but that in a relatively small race, for example, could actually have a major impact.
Right, absolutely. So that's one example of a weakening, and that really has more legs than another bill, which was a straight repeal because it has a Senate companion, has quite a few co-sponsors in the House. But right now, we're more worried about it being tagged onto something big like an appropriations bill,
Yep.
because this is the kind of thing that they want to sneak in and they want it to fly under the radar.
All right, Sarah Levin, Senior Legislative Associate for the Secular Coalition of America, for America. We will be following it, and thanks so much for talking to me about it today.
Thanks so much for having me.